Hi, I'm Aaron from Washington State Parks, and I'd like to present to you a program about Lewis and Clark called Blood and Butts. When people learn about Lewis and Clark or other folks in American history, they sometimes get to thinking that Lewis and Clark were a bunch of superheroes. But I'm here to tell you that Lewis and Clark were not superheroes. They were ordinary mistake-making Americans just like you and me. So I've got 3 stories to tell you from the Lewis and Clark expedition. The first story I have for you happens when Lewis and Clark were on the way home. On the way home, Lewis and Clark split up. Clark took half the party south to explore the Yellowstone River, while Lewis took the other half north to explore the Marias River. Lewis's expedition would take him into the territory of the Blackfoot Indians. The Blackfoot Indians had lived up there on the Canadian border for about 10,000 years, and they had earned themselves a reputation for being fierce defenders of their homeland. Luckily, Lewis knew this. He had been warned by Jefferson to avoid the Blackfoot at all costs. No diplomacy was necessary. Just sneak through their land and make me a map. So Lewis and his men were in a dangerous part of the expedition. They were sneaking through unfamiliar territory where they might be attacked at any moment. The most dangerous part of every day was when someone had to go out and get dinner. This was such a dangerous job that Lewis ordered that they should all share this task and take turns. So each night, 2 different men were selected to go hunting. On the night where the story takes place, it was Lewis and Cruzette who were chosen to go hunting. So they each grabbed a rifle, and at Lewis and Clark's expedition, they mostly had matching rifles, and all of their rifles carried a very unusual type of ammunition, a .54 caliber round ball. Lewis and Clark's expedition were the only people in the country that had rifles just like that. So they each grabbed one of these unique rifles, and they headed out into the dense forest to try to find something to eat. As they snuck through the woods, they got separated. Lewis in front and Cruzette toward the rear. And before long, they could hear and eventually see that there was a group of animals in front of them. Herd of elk. Cruzette couldn't see a whole elk at once. He could just see little glimpses and pieces and parts in the gaps between the dense vegetation. But at one point, he saw a patch of elk skin pause between 2 tree trunks. So he raised his rifle to his one good eye. Cruzette only had one eye. He raised his rifle to his one good eye, and he aimed it as best as he could, squeezed the trigger, and boom! It was a direct hit. Meanwhile, 50 yards in front of him was Lewis. Lewis was also stalking the same group of elk through the dense forest. And Lewis also came to a point where he was sure he had a shot. So he raised his rifle and prepared to fire. But before he could, he heard a loud boom from behind him, followed by a searing hot pain in his butt. "I've been shot," he cried. And he looked back to see that he had one of the weirdest wounds in all of American history, because that bullet had entered his right butt cheek, right about where my pocket starts. It had gone through the right butt cheek, made a brief appearance in the middle, before entering the left butt cheek and tearing its way across that one, becoming lodged in his pants on the other side, for a total of at least 4 holes in Lewis's butt. And although he was seriously hurt, his next thought was for his teammate and friend, Pierre Cruzette. "Pierre!" he cried. "You still back there?" And although Cruzette was just 50 yards back with a smoking gun in his hand, he said nothing. He crouched down and hid in the bushes. Lewis's mind was racing. He was trying to figure out exactly what had just happened. And then he remembered Jefferson's warning about the Blackfoot and how they would attack invaders without warning. He had just been shot by the Blackfoot, and they had captured Cruzette. He had to warn everybody. So he grabbed the butt cheek in each hand, held a rifle under one arm, and ran back to camp as fast as he could, where he told the guys gathered there, "Hey, look at my butt." It was the Indians, and they've got Cruzette. So they all grabbed their rifles and followed the bleeding captain back out into the woods. And they searched high and low, but they could not find any Blackfoot attackers. During the search, Lewis was losing blood. He started to become woozy, and he called to the closest sergeant, happened to be Sergeant Patrick Gass. He said, "Gass, take me back to camp and help me with my butt." So as they staggered back off towards camp, the other men kept looking for the attackers. Now back at camp, it was all Lewis could do to just bend over and grab onto one of the canoes while he asked for Patrick Gass to please have a close look at his butt. So Patrick Gass turned his head to one side and started to undo Lewis's trousers. Meanwhile, out in the woods, they're all looking for the Blackfoot, but the only person they can find is Cruzette. Cruzette denies knowing anything about what just happened, and they all decide to go back and check on the captain. And it just so happens that they arrive back at camp at the exact moment that Patrick Gass pulls down Lewis's pants, whoosh! And as he does, out drops the bullet. And when the bullet hit the ground, they looked at the bullet, and they looked at Lewis. And they looked at the bullet, and they looked at Cruzette. And they looked at the bullet, and they knew that that was not a bullet that was used by the Blackfoot. That was a .54 caliber round ball unique to the Corps of Discovery. They knew at that moment that it was Cruzette who had shot the boss. Imagine yourself as Cruzette at this point. You are the one-eyed French-Canadian civilian on the Lewis and Clark expedition. You've done a great job up till the very last week of the whole trip when it looks like you just killed the boss. You might expect some serious punishment, but Cruzette didn't receive anything of the sort, because Lewis understood that Cruzette was a team player. Cruzette was risking his own life to get food for the rest of the party. And so this is not only a funny example of a mistake made by a history maker, but also a good illustration of how Lewis was a type of leader who could sort of play two roles. In one sense, he could be a strict military commander, and then when needed, he could pull out more of what I would call the soccer mom style leadership, where it was more of just teamwork. But Lewis was not immune to making mistakes, and my next story for you is Lewis's funny mistake that happened near a big waterfall. This is more toward the beginning of the expedition. The whole party is headed west in the fleet of canoes, and they come across a huge waterfall blocking their path. It looks like it's going to take days to drag the boats around it, and they want to take the easiest way. So Lewis orders them to make camp, and he says that he is going to go investigate the two possible ways to go around the waterfall and go up one side and come back down the other side, and whichever way was easier, just go that way. So he grabbed his walking stick, backpack, his rifle, and he headed off on a 2-day trip up and around the Great Falls of the Missouri. Now, as he went, he was doing science. He always had science in mind when he traveled, and so he was taking rock samples and measurements and notes and such. When he got to the top of the waterfall, he took a measurement of how deep it was, how wide it was. He noted different things about the river, such as its speed and what the bottom was like. And when he got to the other side of the river, he was very tired, so he decided he would go to sleep and finish the trip in the morning. But he needed dinner, so he looked around for something to eat. And what he saw was a herd of buffalo, and in the back of the herd was what he said was the biggest buffalo he'd ever seen in his life. And he figured that the rest of the party would be passing this spot soon, so he better shoot enough food so that there'll be leftovers for everybody else. One problem was this buffalo was 200 yards away. And 200 yards is a long shot, especially with the old-style rifle that Lewis had. But Lewis was very good with this rifle. It was a rifle he had made specifically for the expedition. And before the expedition, he had been in the regular army, National Guard, and even in what was similar to the Special Forces back then. He was in a snipers brigade called the Chosen Rifles. And in the snipers brigade, his boss was Clark, the same guy who went on the trip with him. And as Lewis's sniper teacher, Clark taught Lewis about the tools of a sniper. He needed a nice rifle, which Lewis had, gunpowder and bullets, which Lewis had, and Clark also advised that he always carry a special type of walking stick called an espontoon. It was designed with a cross piece so that you could rest the espontoon on the ground and then you could rest the rifle on the espontoon. Because these rifles were very heavy. They weighed about as much as a gallon of milk. Can you imagine holding a gallon of milk out at arm's length while you aimed it at a distant target and trying to hold it perfectly still? It would be difficult unless you had something to rest the milk on. And that's where the espontoon came in handy. So Lewis put down his espontoon, he rested the rifle across it, and he took a careful aim at the buffalo. Pulled the trigger and boom! The gun went off. It was a direct hit. The buffalo fell over, died peacefully. Lewis walked over there making one of the worst mistakes of his life. Because he got over to the buffalo, he got down on one knee, grabbed a knife from his sheath, and he started to cut one juicy steak from the back of the buffalo. But he should have cut two steaks because he had company. America's largest carnivore is coming to dinner. And the largest carnivore in the lower 48 at the time was a grizzly bear. Now, the sight of this grizzly bear caused Lewis to have a flashback. And he remembered the first time he had seen a grizzly bear. So I want to take you back to that time. At the time when Lewis first saw a grizzly bear, he was not alone, but he was walking in the woods with 7 other Army guys. These were all privates. And they had heard about grizzly bears but never seen one before. They saw something on the trail up ahead. It turned out to be a sleeping grizzly bear. Lewis really wanted to do science on a grizzly bear. And in order to do science on a grizzly bear back in the olden days, you need to kill it, unfortunately. So he ordered the closest private, happened to be Private Reuben Field. He said, "Private Field," I said, "you see that small fuzzy hill up ahead on the trail?" And Reuben was like, "Yeah?" And he said, "That's a sleeping grizzly bear. I want you to walk up, sneak up to it, and shoot it for science." Reuben was like, "Okay, I'll do it." So he snuck up as quietly as he could to the sleeping grizzly bear, and when he was right over top of it, he shot it for science. The grizzly bear woke up in a terrible mood. And it started to chase Reuben Field back in the direction of Lewis and the other men. Lewis shouted, "Run!" And they all ran away from the grizzly bear as fast as they could. One by one, Lewis would call out people's names. He would say, "Private Shield, turn and fire!" And Shields would turn and boom, Shield fired. Shield hit the bear in the chest and the bear kept coming. They would run a little bit further. And Lewis would call out someone else's name, "Private Cruzette, turn and fire!" And Private Cruzette would turn and boom! Cruzette managed to hit the bear. It still kept on coming, so they ran a little bit further. And one by one, Lewis called out the names of all 7 of the men with him, and one by one, they all turn. They all hit the bear, and it just kept coming until the very last guy with the very last bullet managed to hit the bear in the head, and it finally died. So on that day, Lewis learned valuable lessons, not only in grizzly bear anatomy, but also in how not to kill one. So, fast forward to the time by the waterfall. Lewis is sitting there with the dead bison in front of him. The grizzly bear is approaching. He has a flashback, and he knows that he's got to hit this one in the head on the very first try. Now, this might sound difficult for you or me, but we're talking about Meriwether Lewis here. He is an American history maker. Trained and confident. He puts his S-pontoon on the ground. He rests the rifle across the top of it, and he takes a slow and careful aim at the grizzly bear. Squeezes the trigger and click! When he heard the click instead of the boom, he realized what his mistake was. No ammo. Forgot to reload. So he starts to back away from the bison, and the grizzly charges him at top speed. And at top speed, they say a grizzly bear can outrun a horse. Well, apparently so can Meriwether Lewis, because he beat that bear in a race to the river, and on the way over, Lewis came up with a new plan. It was a plan based on science. Lewis knew from recent measurements that the Missouri River was 5.5 feet deep and flowing fast. He knew from recent measurements that grizzly bears were only about 5 feet tall across the top of their back. And he knew from his Army records that he was 6 feet tall or more. So he calculated that if he could get into the middle of the river, he would still be able to stand up, but the bear would be forced to swim. And the swimming bear would be carried away by the swift-flowing river over the waterfall and be smashed on the rocks below. Sounded like a good plan, so he dove into the river. He waded out until he was about lip deep in the Missouri, and then he turned around hoping to see the grizzly bear float by. But instead, he learned something new about grizzly bears. They can stand on their hind feet. And on its hind feet, a grizzly bear is 10 feet tall. This thing was getting ready to kill Lewis. Lewis had no time to reload. He had no friends to help him, and it looked like this would be his death. But in the very last moment before his own death, he got another idea. This was an idea based on self-confidence and an unconventional weapon. He summoned up his courage, and he convinced himself he could kill the bear with a walking stick. And then he grabbed that walking stick like a baseball bat and tried to convince the bear. He ran at it screaming, "Aah!" But he never got a chance to make contact with that bear because the bear believed in Lewis. It turned around 180 degrees and ran off to the horizon, and was never seen again. After Lewis changed his pants, he loaded his gun, and he never made that mistake again. So I hope you see that Lewis was a mistake maker who also made history. Cruzet was a mistake maker who also made history. And of course, anyone you've ever read about in a history book is just an ordinary mistake-making person like you. So remember that when you make your next mistake, and when you wake up tomorrow, remember that you have the same job as Meriwether Lewis. It might take you your whole life, but your job is to write the next chapters in American history. Thank you.